Ladies and gentlemen, that is a song called Mobilize. It's off a World War One themed metal album called The Tower by Los Angeles based musician Jason Adams. His nom de guerre being Old Grey Horror. That's Old Grey spelled with an E, proper British Canadian. Old Grey Horror. When I say this album is World War One themed, I don't mean it's just the artwork or the names of the tracks and something along those lines is reminiscent of the subject at hand. This album is absolutely slow cooked in World War One minutia. That's personal accounts, wider military history, and more besides. It's a subject of particular interest to me. It's long been an interest of mine, and evidently it is for Jay as well. And I thought it'd be cool to have a conversation just to discuss why he decided to make this album, how he went about it, some of the sources that he used, and so forth. What you're about to hear is that conversation that Jay and I had. What you'll hear in the background are samples of the tracks from the album, which I thought would maybe kind of spice things up, give you a little taste of what it is. Like I said, it's a very, from my perspective, of course, very cool piece of art. It's a subject that is still extraordinarily relevant today, perhaps now, given recent events more than ever. And I just hope you enjoy the conversation. World War One on vinyl. That's pretty unique. Cool. Well, again, thanks, Jay. This is really cool. So I guess maybe just the where to start. I did some background sleuthing on yourself, and we've had a bit of a back and forth for a while. Just some of your past work. But why don't we just start off with some really general stuff? Who are you? Where are you from? And what do you do? Just kind of in your day job, and then we'll move into the actual album.
Okay. My name is Jason Adams. I'm originally from Little Rock, Arkansas. I went to school in Boston and lived there for about 10 years, and that's where I got started in music. My day job is basically a freelance software developer. I do mostly, I'd say I'm full stack, but I'm primarily sort of the back end, databases and sort of, server side code and all that sort of stuff. In years ago, I don't want to date myself too much, but I'll go for it. Around 1998, I joined a band called
Don't worry about that. No one's going to judge it.
Yeah. So in 1998, I joined a band called 17, and we eventually became Lustra because we got sued by the parent company of 17 magazine. They're like, you can't use that name. You got to change it because you guys are sort of little perverts. Like, screw you. So we changed our name and moved to Los Angeles. We were getting like a little bit of radio airplay and stuff in Boston, and eventually we're like, we sort of exhausted the possibilities here. We can't seem to pick up any major label interest. We got signed to a small label, but the resources available to us were limited. So we decided to go to Los Angeles because we had a bunch of friends in the TV biz. And so we moved to Los Angeles in 2001, and in 2003 we were selected to perform a song called "Scotty Doesn't Know" in the movie Eurotrip, which came out in 2004. That record, that song went gold in August 2021. So it was sort of what we were known for. And that band has been sort of fallow, for lack of a better term.
You're talking to a farmer too, so that's a perfectly appropriate term.
Yeah. So Chris was the lead singer. We cameo in the movie with Matt Damon cavorting, pretending that he's the lead singer, lip syncing and stuff like that. And it's a famous cameo that he's done that people seem to really get a kick out of. They mentioned it in a Rolling Stone article recently or whatever. So that's sort of like what I was known for musically, and that band was very much sort of like jocular punk songs, jokes about awkward sexual situations or confused orientation sexually and stuff like that. A lot of jokey sort of songs. And that kind of petered out to some degree, and I still felt as though I had something to offer musically, and so I started to try to work on this latest record around 2013, I think it was. That's me. That's sort of the broad strokes, I think, there.
Right on. So that I was gonna ask that for a clarification when you did start working on this, but so that's some considerable time then. Like we're talking a decade of decade of
Yeah.
material here. So
Well, I don't have any label support or anything like that, and so I I don't have, 1,500 bucks a day to go into a professional studio. So it's
yeah,
just a matter of finding the time to cook up the songs, come up with the concepts. I was reading a bunch of material. I love to read about the First World War. And so, yeah, it took a long time because there was a lot of individual effort, and I had to find some money to pay the drummers, because when you want to try to do something that elaborate and tricky with the music, you sort of have to get a real pro to play, and so you have to
yeah.
fund the money to get those guys to work and so on. So yeah, it took quite a while.
Right on. Well, let's. I guess maybe we just dive right into it. A second question here: Why World War One? I presume. Actually, let me back that up. So before we started chatting, I went through my bookshelf to try and find all of the like regular World War One primary source stuff.
Yeah.
So I've got your usual your Western Front, All Quiet on the Western Front, Robert Graves,
Yeah.
Ernst
Love Robert
Younger,
Graves.
all that
Yeah.
kind of
Ernst
stuff.
Younger, Robert Graves, those personal like sort of accounts are the best. I love those the most.
Yeah, I think the John Lucy one. I don't know if you've read that one or not. The Devil in the
I,
Drum.
I have not.
I highly recommend that one as well. I think it's it's just it's just different. It's kind of slightly different cultural takes on the same experiences, right? Which I've always found interesting. Anyway, okay, so that's a tangent. We can come back to that. Why World War One? So I'm assuming you're a bit of a history buff in general,
Uh,
just based on this particular piece of media. But what drew you to it?
I came late to history as a buff, let's say. I always found it onerous to have to memorize, oh, the robber barons did this and that, and there was the antitrust act, Sherman antitrust act. And so I always found that stuff very tedious when I was younger. But uh, conflict, wars in general, I was very curious about. I want to say that my first real interest in it grew when I was in third grade, and they said we're going to learn how to use the library. And this is back in the day where you had the card catalog and stuff.
Yeah, I remember that it overlapped
Subject
with me.
card, author card, title card. Yeah.
Yeah,
So we were getting ready to learn about that. We were 8 or 9 years old, and they said go home and try to think about what sort of book you might want to get. And so I asked my older brother, who had done this the year before, Steve. I was like, what books are good to get? And he's like, oh, it was the usual stuff, dinosaurs, sharks, pythons, anacondas, Dracula, Frankenstein, Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff. But then he goes, and World War One and World War Two. And I was like, wait, what do you mean? Like, what are those? And he launched into like all the cool stuff. There's Cowboys and Indians was a thing in the 70s. Every kid played it.
yeah,
You had your 6-shooter with the caps or whatever. But then he starts to describe it. He's like, oh, there's tanks and there's airplanes, there's pillboxes, and there's no man's land. And then when he mentions no man's land, I was like, what is that? He's like, it's what they're fighting over. It's this place that is not one country or the other. It doesn't belong to anyone. And they're fighting to see who gets control of it. And it's like, to me, it was like, there's a very immediate aspect to it. I think that humans are very naturally interested in conflict, at least, young little testosterone ridden boys,
yeah.
perhaps.
Well, I'm in that category clearly. So yes, I would agree.
It just seemed like endlessly fascinating. And so when I went to the library, I was looking for this thing, and there's just a lot of information on it. This is sadly much closer to the actual Second World War than it is to today. So it was like there was a lot of books about it. There was a lot of stuff on TV. There's Kelly's Heroes and The Longest Day and all these movies they would show on TV and stuff that were just so cool. So that's kind of where it started. But then again, like I was interested in technical stuff more, computers, that sort of thing. But then I I ended up reading about, I think it was the Third Battle of Passchendaele, or 30 Prey, Battle of Passchendaele, on the Wikipedia page, and just fell down the K-hole and was like reading about the mud and the people sinking in the mud and the entire trucks sinking into the mud and the duck boards and just the sort of like gothic agony of the whole thing. Yeah. I was just like, I can't believe people would do this. And there's something about it that's very, how does an individual put themselves through this? What sort of like fortitude does it take for people to do this, to like murder each other or whatever. It's endlessly fascinating to me that people were willing to undergo this, the lice and the mud and the blood and just everything, the disease, the dysentery and whatnot. And so you start to say, why would people do this? I can't believe it's this agonizing. And then you start to think about all the things that happen in this span of time. It's just like, it's the greatest inflection point in all of history, in my opinion, where you go from this agrarian past to like this, to planes and tanks. And then within a span of 50 years, you have X-rays and wireless telegraphy, and you have radiation, and you have special relativity and general relativity and quantum mechanics. And it culminates in 45, from 1895 to 1945, it culminates in an atomic bomb explosion. It's just the most, it's like the hockey stick where civilization comes of age. It's like the adolescence of human civilization in some sense. And it's terrifying in many respects, but to me, it's just like, one of the best anecdotes I can think of is from a Peter Hart book, where some German corporal or lieutenant is sitting there, and this guy comes running up to him in the trench in a froth. He's in a panic, and he's like, the guy's like, "What's going on? Calm down." And then the guy's like, "There's a crocodile coming into the trench." And he's like, "What? You're crazy. You've lost your mind." And he realizes that he goes to check it out, and he sees a tank. And this German, he might have been Bavarian, I can't remember. He was from some agrarian place, right? He lived on a farm with horses, probably, and he just couldn't comprehend what a tank was.
There literally isn't a word in his parlance at that time that could actually adequately describe what he's seeing.
Yeah, and he like uses, he thinks it's a giant animal. And maybe it's caked in mud, maybe it looks organic perhaps and not metallic, but he was like, there is a crocodile coming here to kill us. And so it's like, to me, that sort of, it's in a tiny little nugget that sort of touches on just this vast sea change that happened. And I the more I've read about it, the more vast and enormous it is. And so it's nearly impossible to come to grips with in its entirety. But it's just, there's so much that happened, and it continues to influence everything to this day. It's endlessly fascinating to me.
Well, I mean, we're literally watching a war right now that has very powerful echoes of this very subject. So, I mean, to say what that's an understatement. Two quick thoughts. One, it's, I think, very interesting, and it would be the for all of my Canadian brothers and sisters, the fact that the Third Battle of Ypres and Passchendaele is one of the things that really turned you on to the subject, because that one, as I'm sure you're well aware, is very important for us Canadians, because it was such a significant battle for our armed forces at that time.
Second Ypres as well. Second Ypres, the gas attack in April 1915.
Yeah,
I am obsessed with that. I found and the Canadian involvement in particular, I ran across, thanks to your archives, there were some war diaries from the 7th Battalion, the Duke of Connacht's own British Columbia Regiment, was at Second Ypres, and E.D. Bellew won a Victoria Cross for a rearguard action when the Germans broke this hole 4 miles wide in the Allied line. He was lieutenant in charge of the machine gun section of the 7th Battalion, and he set up his machine gun and was just laying it down. And like they basically held the line. There's a my wife, God bless her, we went to Paris for our honeymoon, but we also got to go to Ypres.
I was going to ask if you got to go there. Yeah.
I was like, can we go visit Ypres? She's like, okay, sure. And she booked us a hotel room. When I opened the curtains, it was the cloth hall, like right there. And I was like, oh my God, I broke into tears. Anyway, my wife is wonderfully supportive in this whole quixotic endeavor. It's just the whole thing, all the things that happened around Ypres, and in particular, the 7th Canadian Battalion, 1st Division, their involvement in Second Ypres is fantastic. And this guy, E.D. Bellew, won the Victoria Cross because he basically held the line. And there's a monument at St. Julian, the brooding soldier, which commemorates this action by the Canadians. So I went there, I stood on the field, because there's drawings in the war diaries, and there's like accounts of which towns they stayed in and how many casualties. One perhaps 20-page document that is a a description specifically of what happened and sort of the things they saw. They saw people running past in retreat. There was an inquest by the commanding officers and all this detail, and it just like jumps out of history and it just you're there. It's like you can see the typed notes, you can see the hand scribbled drawings that the guys made in the dirt while they were like fighting the battle. So it's just like you just sort of, it's a window that opens up and you can sort of peer through all those old timey, videos where the guys walk a little too fast, and you can just like get right into the thoughts of the guys that were there. So it's like I'm totally obsessed with the Canadian involvement in the First World War.
Well, that's awesome to hear. You talk about tearing up a little bit. I tell you, I had the opportunity to go to that area. Went to a few different spots. Passchendaele is one of them. And of course, being Canadian, the pilgrimage that you're almost obliged to do is Vimy Ridge. And yeah, I definitely welled up a little bit there. Very unexpected, because I was even less sentimental then than I am, or than I am now. Which is I'm making a joke of myself, my own expense, but no,
I know what you mean.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'll have to cart you off in a wheelchair if you go back.
I think so. Well, and I know, I mean, this was 10 years ago, and I know so much more now than I did even, and I knew a lot then, but I know so much more now, and particularly, like, to your point, these personal accounts, when you really dive into the day-to-day experiences of these people. And I guess this would be a great segue to start talking about your album, because otherwise I'll just prattle on about this for hours. But those day-to-day experiences where it really, you think, like, it's a cheesy question to ask yourself, but it's always like, what would I do? Probably just die is what the answer is. But it's
I was in the Boy Scouts for like a hot minute when I was a kid, and I had this one bad experience camping, and we set up our tent, and all the pros like had their tents on these like elevated areas, and then we set up ours on this grassy, soft place and thought we're gonna have a great sleep, and it starts to rain.
Yeah.
And of course, we're in the low-lying area where all the water starts to come in, so eventually our tent starts to fill up with water, and we're just lying in sleeping bags, soaking wet in this water. So we had to get up in the middle of the night, move our tent onto a hillside, and then you're sort of like sliding down this hillside, being devoured by mosquitoes. It was just like, it was horrible. And so when I think of these guys who spent 4 years sleeping on the ground in the bottom of the trench, being devoured by lice, I'm like, how did they do it? And then not even to mention the sort of like artillery fire and the bullets and the barbed wire and the illness, and lack of food. Yeah. It's like the fortitude again. It's remarkable. I don't think I'm not cut out for that kind of thing. I'm a soft man, very soft.
Yeah, we like to think we're not, but we all are. Let's go into the album. And so again, you mentioned that it was a long work in progress. Was it, when did it actually come to you, like, you know what I should do? I should put this put this on some vinyl.
Okay. I was in a band with this guy, John Baird. He was in Lustra for a while, and we loved to go out on the Boston scene, to the Rathskeller, to the Middle East, to these clubs around there. And we used to see all these bands. We ate it up. It was like amazing to go see them all. And one day he showed me a record by a band called Orangutan that was called Dead Sailor Acid Blues. And it was a concept album about like drowning, sailors perishing at sea, all these sailor tropes. But it was like every song was sort of tied together by this concept. And I was like, I love this so much. I love it so much. We had it on CD, but I was like, you know what? I want to make a concept album. I'd love to make a concept album. So the first idea I had that I wanted to make a concept album was, mid 90s, probably 96, 97. And then didn't have a chance. I was in this band, Lustra. We're doing we got ourselves in a movie that had a release, and all this kind of stuff, and we could just never agree on what songs to work on. It was a constant like ego battle in a lot of respects. And we're writing these puerile songs about, like I said, sex jokes or something. And the idea that you could write a concept album, to me, just stuck with me for so long. And then after that, the band sort of, went on indefinite hiatus. I was like, well, I've gone through all this trouble. I was the band nerd. I learned recording stuff, the gear, the Pro Tools. I had purchased microphones over the years. I bought a Pro Tools rig for the rehearsal space. I bought one at home so I could just shuttle the files back and forth on a hard drive. And so I had all this equipment that I acquired over 10 years. And I was like, I still want to make music. And I thought that I want to make something nice and heavy. And I started to think about, you know, if you're, how about some metal? I had seen a band called Cave In. I was not a fan of the new metal thing much. There's like a certain self-absorption and a lot of the lyrics that you find in Korn and in, Limp Bizkit and in what's the band Linkin Park. It's all just like, oh, I got these problems, the trauma. You just,
And you're talking to a guy sitting here talking to you in a Motorhead shirt, so I think we understand each other.
Yeah, like at least he's got vigor. It's like he's like, I don't care. I'm gonna ace of spades, motherfucker. I feel tough. So there was a certain vigor to him that I much more enjoy. But then to me, it was always about I wanted to try to. I was a big fan of the Jane's Addiction record, Ritual de lo Habitual, which is super psychedelic. I wanted to make a psychedelic record. I wanted it to be very heavy. And then at one point, I was just like, maybe I was thinking about the library book concept. If you're going to make a heavy record about something, what is it? Is it Frankenstein? Is it vampires? Or is it? And I was like, oh, World War. The World War, the war. It's some kind of war thing. And then I think you asked one of the questions in an email, why not World War II and why World War One? And I think that it was the World War II is just like it's in so many places at once immediately. You've got Asia and you've got Japan and you've got Hitler and then you've got all these different things going on, Molotov, Ribbentrop, and then there's no sort of point. World War One is a much cleaner. Everybody always starts the history with Franz Ferdinand getting assassinated, and of course the tension started before that. But there's this singular event, and it just seemed like that seems like it might be pretty cool. And then you have the sort of like the von Schlieffen plan. It's like, oh, they've been planning this for years. It starts to unfold a bit like Lord of the Rings or some sort of like epic story. It's got much more of a start and finish. And I focused on the Western Front because it's the locality that I understand the most. I think it's been written about a lot in English, and so plenty of stuff happened in other places and whatnot. But I think that just it was around 2013. I think I wrote on Facebook, I am going to make a heavy metal record about the First World War, and some friends were like, "This is the best thing I've ever, way to go, dude! I want to be involved in this." And other people are like, have fun with that, or whatever. But it was around 2013 that I finally was like, it's got to be that. And I didn't have a sense of the shape of it in its final form much yet, but I was like, I want to make vinyl. It's like the big. I remember buying my first record with my brother. We pooled our allowance. We bought a Kiss double album live that had like
I think
I don't even like I don't even like Kiss very much at all. But they had the like dragon's teeth boots and the sort of black get. I know it's just this huge format. And I remember seeing at like Spencer's Gifts and stuff, all the Iron Maiden like artwork with the Monster Eddie or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's really eye-catching, and I think at the time I was thinking about this. I'm a fan of Fu Manchu, the SoCal band Fu Manchu, and they sing a lot about cars and driving and like Godzilla and monster movies and things like that. I was like, there's a kind of a adolescent sort of thing about metal that I felt like you have to sort of honor that, and you have to sort of enthusiastically embrace the irony of singing about monsters as a grown man.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, I want it to be big format. I was like, it's got to be vinyl. And I was thinking at the time, a double album for sure. And then it's so much effort to get one made that it turned out to be only one record. But I definitely wanted a gatefold, and the big, the big format art just seems really important to do something like that, because the CD art is never that interesting to me. No. And cassettes are even smaller, but like a big old gatefold. My brother, again, huge influence. He had, some Zeppelin records, all that kind of stuff. This is where I started to form the idea of being in a rock and roll band. And one day I went and raided his record stash, and he wasn't home. I put on the giant cans and listened to the entirety of Dark Side of the Moon. And it's got all the lyrics on it. It's got the big gatefold. It's got the awesome album art. And the poetry is something you can comprehend as like a 13-year-old kid. It's not over your head or anything like that. So it's like, I really enjoy that experience. And was like, I would like to make something like that, it's got the lyrics on the inner sleeve or something. It's got a really cool cover and back cover or whatever. And there's a gatefold you can look at. It's like, the idea that you could put it on, listen to it in its entirety, and it would make a sort of coherent experience to take you away for 45 minutes or whatever. It seemed like something worth going after.
Yeah, that's I think it's interesting. You talk about trying to get a double LP, and as much as I could have personally just absolutely eaten up too. I think the idea, and again, coming from like the Motorhead fan in me, right? Having a nice tight 45 or so minute
Yeah.
LP is that flows together as well as it does. And again, not like I'm a music critic or anything. I just like it, and I thought that was a really fun aspect of it.
Well, we've got LPs like Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville, and it's like I think it's 3 records, and it wasn't intended as a the old fashioned double sided album, coherent little package that makes sense. You flip it, you play one side, you play the other side, it's done. And then we've got Lonerism by Tame Impala, and it's 3 records as well. So it's like those are sort of CD albums that have been sort of crammed into vinyl format, and it's not as pleasing. I don't think there's a bit of a square peg in a round hole kind of thing going on.
Well, and when you go to buy one at a shop, because there's 3 of them in there, they want $100 and some for it, which is like absurd.
It's actually quite a chore to bring it down, because you only get like 20 minutes aside on vinyl. I had a really excellent mastering engineer do the vinyl cutting, Scott Hull, who's actually been cutting vinyl for Masterdisc since the 80s. So he was there at the heyday, and he's been cutting ever since. And so he was a very good Sherpa, if you will, to get into the vinyl thing. But yeah, it was hard to sort of get everything down. And then when the second side of my record is, I think, 24 minutes. And so it's really pushing. If you get too much longer, then the quality of the audio can be it suffers quite a bit if you get too long. But he did a great job of bringing out the low end and stuff, because you have to get the grooves really close together, the more length you have and so on. So it's a bit of a chore to get it down, but I thought it was really important to do so.
That's cool. Well, you mentioned artwork, so let's start with that, and maybe we can just kind of roll into why you chose the tracks and the subjects that you did. But so the artwork, and our little bit of a back and forth before, I had mentioned I really like the back cover, and I guess I was right in my assumption it was one of those giant rail guns.
Well, technically, it's this would not be moved. Well, it'd be moved by rail to the approximate location, but then they would take it off the train.
Yeah.
And they have these little tractors, like a 15 horsepower tractor, and they would put it on 5 tractors, the giant wheels, the barrel on one tractor, and they had a gantry crane, and they would drive this particular one to some hidden behind a ridge, kind of like hollow, and they would reassemble the thing. This might take several days to reassemble the whole thing, but it was I believe it's a howitzer actually, and it's mobile. Like they can drive it to a location. There was a different variation of this particular gun that they had to create a concrete emplacement. It would take them like 96 hours of like construction labor to dig a hole in the ground for the concrete.
These were different than the the literal Paris guns, right? Because that was they weren't a howitzer. They were from a long much further.
Yeah, the Paris gun had a very long barrel that's supported by some like weird little braces. Very long, skinny barrel, not a very large projectile. This particular gun would shoot a 42 centimeter diameter projectile that was about 5 feet long. It weighed about 1,000, maybe 1,800 kilograms, or no, 1,800 pounds, 2,000. It weighed about a ton. So it's like shooting a Volkswagen 9 or 10 miles.
Yeah.
And when it lands, they used these to demolish the forts in Belgium at the very beginning of the war. They built these forts, these fortifications, and the Germans rolled up with these guns that they had sort of kept a secret, and just the guys in the fort would hear them registering the shots one by one. They'd be creeping, they'd fire a shot that would fall short. They adjust the trajectory and it would get a little closer. And so inside the fort, the guys just hear these astoundingly loud, 1-ton bomb explosions that just get closer and closer until they just like hit the roof, and like the whole thing just shakes. And they blew these Belgian forts up. They hit like the magazine in one of them, and it was just, the thing was completely totaled. And the Belgians eventually surrendered. I think that the commanding officer was dragged out unconscious, and he's like, there's nothing we can do. So the Belgians use these like mobile guns to get close to their targets.
I think that if I remember correctly, I think that story is one of the ones that Dan Carlin relays in his series on it. It's been
Yeah,
a
which
long
is
time since
awesome.
I've listened to it, but yeah, definitely, definitely my favorite of his work. That's for sure. Um, but and so all of that in one piece of artwork on the back cover. Let's talk about the front. Is that I have a sneaking suspicion that that image of the church tower or the tower, I mean the namesake of the album is I can't remember what it is, but there's a famous case during the war where there was a church that got hit and it had like a hanging
Right.
Madonna statue.
Yeah.
Is that what that is?
No, the tower on the front is the Ypres Cloth Hall, which is sort of
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
the cloth hall that they
Yeah.
shelled like sort of early in the war. And there's a famous picture by an Australian photographer. I think his name is Frank Hurley.
Mhm.
And I think it might be a montage of two different pictures, one with the sun coming out behind it, but there's a single soldier standing in front of the Ypres Cloth Hall. And it's that sort of I saw this and I was like, God, this is such a beautiful picture. And I was like, oh, you know what? I was thinking also at some point I had been talking about a title for the thing. I was trying to come up with like, what's the sort of unifying concept here? And if I was speaking with a friend of mine, Michael Carter, who's an artist here in LA, and he deals a lot with like epistemics and how we know what we know and symbols and things like that. And I was like, what are some of the symbols I can extract from the war that I can use as lyrics, that I can use as artwork and so on? And he mentioned we somehow got around to talking about playing cards, like the gambling that soldiers do. You have the suites, diamonds and hearts, money and love, and then you have clubs and spades. Clubs being for conflict, of course, and spades being death. These are sort of derived in some sense from the tarot deck.
Yeah.
So in the tarot deck, you have death, you have the skeleton card or whatever, which is sort of natural. Getting old is death. It's a natural functions. It's a behavior of nature. But then you have the tower, which is like catastrophic, discontinuous, dangerous change. And that's like that's it. That concept is perfect. And so that's when I started to work on the first song, the second side of the record. And I thought that between the Frank Hurley image of the single soldier standing in front of the destroyed Ypres Cloth Hall, and you look at this card, I wish I could just draw up a picture here for you, but Google the Tower Tarot card, and there's this famous picture. It's sort of a medieval drawing. There's a tower getting struck by lightning, and there's two people tumbling out of it. So that
I think I recognize it. I don't know if I think my wife bought a deck of these at some point. Oh yeah, I've seen that before.
yeah. I was like, that's it. That's it's the perfect sort of unifying theme that I couldn't think of anything better. It's catastrophic, discontinuous change, and like the kingdoms are tumbled. It's like the two people falling out of the tower is like a king and his queen. It's when the world gets turned upside down, and there's also tremendous opportunity in this sort of discontinuous change for some sort of scalawag to crawl his way up from the bottom of the hill to the top of the ant heap or whatever. And so just between the sort of image of the tower and that Hurley thing and this tarot card, I was like, I have to make this happen. And so I ended up doing a bunch of trigonometry. I got Blender, which is like a 3D modeling software, and I was like, where's the camera? Is it 50 millimeters? Is it whatever? And I did a lot of sort of calculations to try to say, well, if we want to try to get a realistic human figure, I had bought a authentic 1917 American World War I uniform, an authentic Brody helmet from 1917.
That's very cool.
And I did so much trig. It took me like 2 or 3 weeks in my spare time. We went out to a parking lot in Griffith Park, which is just this park here in LA. There's this big, long parking lot that nobody ever goes to. And I got a light that I calculated that would be at approximately the right angle for an explosion at the top of this, 100-foot tall tower. And so I got there and just, did a few poses. And my friend Dave put a camera, where the original camera would have been in the Hurley picture. And we sort of took pictures of soldiers or, me in a soldier costume to just try to like get an image. And then I used that image to do a sort of, I got some carbon paper and all this stuff. And so I did a tracing of the image and an ink drawing of it because I didn't want to just sort of Photoshop the crap together, and so I ended up doing let's call it analogging, right?
Yeah.
We take some digital imagery, we cook up the sort of light angles and the lighting, all that, and then we just take a pen to it and draw over the whole thing and create an analog hand drawn image from sort of a digital starting point. It just seems more old school, more sort of like cult, if you will, KVLT, this authentic sort of metal ink drawn sort of thing. It just seemed to work a little better, I think, stylistically.
I think this is also just it's a little funny to me for doing what you do for a living in general, and then your instinct is to go super analog on something like this. I think that's kind of a funny little paradox in a way, but very cool.
Well, I hate going direct with all the instruments. You know, I don't like to plug in directly to the board. I like an amp with a mic on it. I like to hear the amp sort of hiss and buzz. I like to hear the in the room, all the microphones echoing off the little walls and stuff. It's just so much. It's so much cooler than like, you know, some super sterile, dry, perfectly isolated guitar track from some digital amp sim or something like that. I use the old Marshall and Boogie amps. I use the Shure 57 mics on them. I got my Les Paul. I had fancy pickups put in it, you know, and the drums, we have 8 mics on them. So it's like, it's all sort of like that. You got to have the air breathing in the room to get that kind of like rich, luxurious old school feel. You know, there's something just really sterile and noisy about the digital stuff that I didn't want that. I really wanted it to be like an analog thing, and that applies to the cover as well. You don't want some sort of, you know, CGI'd photoshopped piece of junk on your album cover.
Yeah, especially if you've taken what will end up being a decade.
The windows were all open. We sat there speaking and listened to the distant sound of thousands and thousands of people singing and cheering outside the railings of Buckingham Palace. Other members of the cabinet came into the room. We sat in silence. Our clock on the mantelpiece ticked out the hours. Then big bells. The crowd outside seemed to be singing and cheering everywhere. But inside the cabinet room, it was silent.
Nice to hear you play a Les Paul too, because that's mine. That's my go-to.
Yeah,
I bought it when I was like 14, and it's still my.
I mean, good work to get it. That's a pricey guitar, so I'm impressed.
It's not a Gibson; it's an Epiphone. But I honestly, I don't care, man. Like it's worked for me really well, and I've run that through. Same thing. I don't like using a whole bunch of pedals. I don't like doing all that stuff. My very limited experience, again, very limited experience with trying to work through digital programs is like it's not my jam, man. I like the simplicity of a big box that hurts my hearing. And I've definitely done that over the years. Okay, well, so so I don't keep you all night here. Let's talk about the track. So again, in our back and forth, you had mentioned a few different things. The one that I remember, because I'm talking about military history, like small arms and materiel and stuff like that. It's like that's something I'm very interested in. And what stuck out to me was you mentioned you're trying to get, and I forget which song it is exactly, but you're trying to get to the beat per minute to match up with what would have been like the firing rate of a Vickers gun or something, which is hilarious and awesome to me.
When you have the drummer's doing the double kick thing, I mean, you can't help but think that, I mean, that sounds like a machine gun, you know, and like if you adjust the tempos are all kind of, it's the whole song by song thing. As you've mentioned before, the war is vast. It's just enormous. And yeah, I love Jutland. And if I was going to do another record, Jutland would be way up in the list, along with Gas Attacks and things like that.
Yeah.
But in reading all the books that are all sort of cross-reference each other, you stumble across certain things that just like scream out to be adapted into a song, or it seems so obvious from this concept that the atmosphere would be this or that, you know.
Yeah.
I saw Holst this week, and he's like, astrology. Oh, I can get it. There's all the different personalities of Mars versus, you know, and so it's like if you have some sort of thing that suggests to you variety and specific modes of expression or specific atmospheres that are all kind of different, it helps immediately to create a more interesting record, I think, because there's a lot of variety from the start. But the various song concepts, I did them one at a time. And the one I started with, of course, is Franz Ferdinand. And there was something, I had worked on the song, and I was trying to get a really good atmosphere for it. So I asked a friend, you know, this would happen in the Balkans, right? It's like some damn foolishness in the Balkans phrase came to mind and all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, immediately I was like, it should sound kind of klezmery or Eastern European or almost Turkish. And I was looking up Turkish music and all that stuff. A friend suggested a particular scale, which I adopted, and immediately it starts to sound like, between the Turkish drums and the scale, it starts to sound like a located, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, it starts to sound like the sort of bazaar with all the like baskets in it or whatever, where people that are fighting and running around with jeeps and stuff. And so you look for specific mood suggestions like that. And then I didn't do any songs really, with a couple of exceptions, until I'd finished the prior one, because if you're trying to get a record that sort of like the songs all link up tonally, you kind of have to wait till the prior song is finished before you start to work on the tonality of the next one.
Yeah, it's hard to make a Terry Gilliam Monty Python absurdist transition between tracks when you're trying to do my wife is going to laugh at me for making it somehow fitting in World War I and Monty Python and Motorhead in the same conversation. But yes, hard to do that kind of thing when you're trying to make it all flow together.
Well, after the first one, you have the idea that this assassination happens, and then I worked in some Morse code, and I was like, I got to get some Morse code in here. And so I just did a sort of like a bunch. I translated all of the sort of opening salvos of diplomatic communications into Morse code, just using some browser-based thing. And then I made a chord out of that. So you have this D minor chord, which picks up where the last one left off. And you have all this Morse code flying around. It's like, we declare war, mobilize the armies and all this kind of stuff. So you have specific statements by the diplomatic teams of Germany and France and all this kind of stuff declaring war on each other. And then I have a recording of Margot Asquith relating her experience about the war being declared. She was the prime minister's wife at the time, and it's her recollecting how it started. And then on the other side, you have Kaiser Wilhelm, a speech that was recorded by him, where he's like, they have forced us to do this. And so it's like you have this two sides of the thing. So you have this sort of build going on. And then I was like, of course, the rape of Belgium, the beginning of hostilities, and this massive German army coming down. And that one, the tempo in that, for example, is 130 beats a minute.
Sorry, this is when you're talking about is that Mobilize or is that
Mobilize? Yeah, Mobilize I made at the speed of a fast march, and it uses some of the language that I extracted from the diplomatic communications. This is treasonous. It's you're violating our agreements, and this is all your fault, and God is with us, and it just seemed like it's got kind of the language at the beginning is like, we're justified. This is totally a good idea, and like these armies marched off to war at a quick march, and people were cheering. They were out of their minds, so happy about this finally coming down.
They thought it was going to be the 1870s again, right?
Yeah, we're going to take over and get another $5 billion from Paris, and then we'll be back home by Christmas or something like that. And then the third one is like, okay, it's turning a little darker. Like, now that the conflict is happening, you would see it. I was imagining, you'd see it on the horizon. There'd be smoke. They'd be burning the church. They'd be ringing the bells in the next town over. And how would it seem when this 2 million man German army starts to sweep through Belgium? I think there's an account, I think it's in Guns of August, of a person in some Belgian town, and there's like battalion after battalion marching through the town 24 hours a day for 3 days. I mean, just imagine all the soldiers coming through your tiny town, just so many of them. The logistics of the plan, all that kind of stuff. And it just seemed like, of course, you have to have the German army marching, and then we have there was more specifically to your question about how did you choose these things, one of the things that jumped up to me was this report of Charles Beck Hornby, the first British soldier to draw blood from a German. There's this tale of him riding with I think they were dragoons. He rides up and they make contact. The tiny British forces suddenly come up at the very front edge of the German attack up in Belgium or northern France. And he is a complete lunatic. He's just like this tough old school British soldier. And he's like, there are some Uhlans. There are German soldiers with the spears on horseback. Yeah. And he gets his sword out and he's like, let's go. And he rides across this field and just skewers a couple of them. And that's where the armies meet. And then he rides back and he jumps off his horse and he takes the sword and he presents it to his commanding officer. It's like, when you have a situation like that, it's like, it's the agrarian sort of horseback riding introduction to the war. And I wrote a sonnet, to start it with, to try to make it seem kind of old, which also helped with all the meter and stuff like that. And then, so it's like you have this sort of old concept of chivalry and war presented with this doubt about how it's going to unfold and maybe there's mortality involved, but you're still trying to frame it like it's some sort of, again, 1870 situation, or, you know, the Crimean War, the charge of the Light Brigade or something like that. And then I had always wanted to do a song about Christmas. So there's the Christmas 1914 song, which is, I wanted it to sound like a creepy Christmas song because, you know, like Benjamin Britten, This Little Babe, has this kind of like apocalypse kind of theme in the song. Give it a listen. It's like, you know, it sounds like a Carmina Burana almost, you know,
yeah.
like the Omen. And then on the second side, it's like, it was like, I have to get bigger. It has to get louder. I have to tune down more. This has to sound more dangerous. And, you know, once you have the sort of static warfare no man's land developing, I was picturing just like the desolation of this bombed out field and all the barbed wire, and just like, it would be something that would just like assault your senses. You know, you could smell it.
I think something that I really enjoyed is when you simultaneously have effectively, again, to me, communicated that you are covered in flies and lice, and also there's rats crawling on your face.
Yeah,
all at the same time.
Or I can't remember where I heard. There's a lot of good podcasts from the Imperial War Museum, and one of the old,
they have great stuff.
Yeah, Voices of the First World War. There was one of the old gravelly voiced guys, and he's like, you'd see the rats everywhere. He's like, the bodies, they'd come out of the rib cage. They'd make a home in the rib cage, and it's just this horrifying, like, first person anecdote. The guy can still see it. You can tell when he's interviewing, and it was probably Peter Hart who was interviewing him. He's talking about how he could see the rats crawling out of a dead person's rib cage because it had made its little nest in there, you know, and it's just like, oh God. So you have these, like, that's the stuff that metal is about sometimes, you know, and, you know, I don't specifically mention that or whatever, but it's like, it's kind of the backdrop. Yeah. The flies, the sickness. And again, I think if you want to try to communicate that sonically or have any sort of, like, you know, cinematographic suggestion, like if the music can suggest a visual, it seemed natural to tune the guitars all the way down, you know.
Would you put it in drop C or something?
Drop B flat. Most of the second half of the record's in drop C, but the first song is drop B flat, which is kind of as low as I can get my guitars without having to, like, have them set up again.
Yeah.
Just slightly heavier.
Start rattling off the fretboard, and then you have to use piano wire or some stupid thing.
Yeah. And I thought that the second half really had to sort of, you know, you flip a record over, what is the first song? You know, it's got to be something impressive. So I really tried to get that down tuned, and, you know, to suggest, instead of this old sort of agrarian horseback riding war, more sort of like a mechanized industrial war. And then after that song, which it's The Tower, I had also around that time I discussed, like I said, with this guy Michael Carter, the sort of symbols that I might use, the cards, the tarot cards sort of stuff. The Tower, you know, idea occurs to me. I was like, oh, it's a perfect, you know, lyric material and so on. But also Donald Trump got elected, and I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, and it really derailed my, like, I had been doing this Twitter thing where I was collecting day-to-day things that happened 100 years ago during the war. It was the anniversary, in part, occasions the World War I thoughts as well. It's like 100 years ago, there's might be some interest in the whole thing. But it just, when he got elected, I was just like, I lost interest in digging through the New York Times archives and finding an article every day about whatever.
Yep.
But, and then The Tower also kind of jives with that. Actually, when he was giving his inauguration speech, I was like, fuck this. I don't want to see about this on social media. I went down to the rehearsal space and recorded the guitar solo on that song. And it kind of, I felt better, you know. It's like I was kind of sublimating or whatever by, like, playing the guitar solo on The Tower, like, while this was happening. It really helped. It was like therapy in a way. It was really nice.
I'm surely there's someone who could dissect a variety of different symbolisms out of doing that particular activity during that during that event.
That was also the first inkling I had of like a sort of modern applicability. Like you mentioned earlier, the Ukraine war. It's like the stuff still happens, and so as soon as I was finishing up, that's when the Ukraine war was breaking out. And the guy who mastered it, Alex DeTurk, is like, it's insane that you're coming out with this record right now, like with this whole, because everybody was sure that, you know, there's going to be another world war breaking out over this thing, which thank goodness it hasn't so far. But that was sort of the first inkling I had that the subject matter was kind of eerily topical in some way. Then the next song, Trommelfuhr, there was a book by, I think Leon Wolf was his name, In Flanders Fields.
Sorry, what just to specify, that is Drumfire, but it's just in German, correct?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. And it sounds creepier in German, right?
Yeah, I think I read that, and I don't know if it was a description of the album or what, but I had a good chuckle, and I agree.
Well, I first heard the Drumfire concept. There was a book by Leon Wolf about Third Ypres, about the Battle of Passchendaele, and he talks about, oh, there's the rattle of this gun, there's the whump of this gun, the whiz bangs, all the sounds they make, the sort of Minenwerfers and all that stuff. He goes, and finally, last of all, there's Drumfire, and he has this like really colorful paragraph describing, and invariably the words that describe Drumfire or Trommelfuhr are like indescribable. It's like, and they're like the language gets really sort of florid and like absolutely baroque in the sort of breathless ways that they describe it. It's just like it evokes fear, but also feelings of exhilaration. If it's your side paying them back, you just get so pumped. It's like there's this idea of the enormous power of it. It sounds like trains flying through the air overhead and stuff. And so that like all the language that I've heard in the various books I've read about Drumfire, it's got such an ordinary prosaic word in English, Drumfire. I mean, what does that mean? But then Trommelfuhr it's like a whole different thing. So it's like that's one of the things you stumble across that appears in many different books, and it's like, of course, sonically, that suggests a whole thing that must be done on a World War I record. You have to have this massive artillery barrage, and I was looking through classical inspiration to try to like, how do you communicate this like enormity? And so I ended up lifting from the beginning, the guitars, the dual guitar section at the beginning is just basically, it's Wagner's funeral march for Siegfried, which is like the death of the hero. It has this theme. And I just, in looking through all the songs and listening to all the stuff on YouTube, trying to find classical inspiration, there's this really great performance of that particular piece. And I was like, oh, it sounds like the Wolf and Peter and the Wolf. It's got the horns that are sort of harmonizing in this minor key thing. And I'd seen it underneath J'accuse. There was a silent French movie where they bring out all the soldiers with the broken aid during the war, and they used that song in the silent movie as the audio backdrop and so on. So it was just, there were so many like reasons to use Wagner in there. It just seemed obvious. Things that sort of one by one you sort of stumble across. You're like, oh, now I have to do it. And then, of course, over the top, a trench raid. I watched videos of sprints. Mile sprints, or like the 400 meters or whatever. The quarter mile sprint. And so you see the tempo at which they run, and that sort of suggests a certain tempo. And then I realized that if you multiply by 3 or 4, you get these approximate tempos of the machine guns and so on. As we corresponded through email, it's a little fast. It's more MG42 territory, but it's like, it sounds like a machine gun, it's or whatever. So you start to get those sort of things. And I was digging through a bunch of classical music for that one as well. I ended up like, there's a John Williams piece from Empire Strikes Back that it's amazing. It's like when they're the battle for Hoth or whatever. So I kind of borrowed some patterns from him for that one. And then you have to shout some stuff, and the drummer pointed out, Zach Morris, for that particular song, pointed out how it sounds like you're getting tired singing. It's like, yeah, I was screaming my balls off. It's like it's exhausting. He's like, well, it's very suitable for the song that you might be tired running. And so he's also doing these insane beats, and so he's kind of getting tired as well. So there's a kind of an exhaustion to it, or like let's start it again. There's a bit of fatigue that you can hear creeping into some of the more intense sections. So we try to leave in a lot of that sort of stuff that suggests the atmosphere of reality, rather than making a perfect, clock synced, automaton like drum beat. You give it some breath and some air and some real human feeling to it. And then there was a book, I have it right here, Price of Glory by Alistair Horn. has a section about how when people leave the battlefront, they would have this like irrationally euphoric feelings. It's like once you get out of the ditch and you go down the communication trench and you're back in the countryside, it's like it's like the Wizard of Oz in color. All of a sudden, it's like your life just transformed, and people would dance and sing, and then they'd want to get drunk. So you have the next song, which is about going to the brothel and like having a good time there. And I wanted to try to get that sort of smelly, opium smoke kind of feeling going on.
It kind of gave me like French Riviera feel a little bit.
Well, I used a scale on that one, which was it's sort of a Middle Eastern scale. Just the idea being, you have these pictures of Mata Hari, right? Mm-hmm. Mata Hari was the spy sort of stripper chick that was executed supposedly for spying, and they got her in all these exotic, like sort of belly dancer outfits. Mm-hmm. So it's like, you want to get your kink on when you hit the brothel, and so there's, there was a story, I think it was in Graves, about there was a woman who wore a captain's uniform, and she like was constantly hired. Like she got a lot of business because she would wear this captain's uniform, and that was a kink for a lot of people, I suppose. But so you had this weird stuff going down in the brothel, and then of course at the end you're drunk, you're wasted, it's raining again, and it seemed like a logical way to sort of finish up with an ode to the drink and the appeal of the shots to just blank your mind, from all the trouble. There's glory in booze that like it's so addictive, I don't, and at least two of my drummers that I use are sober, so I don't want to rhapsodize too much about the allure of drink, but I think that there's a great appeal in it when you're at a party, you're doing the shots, you're just like, I want another, and especially if you have some sort of trauma you're trying to get past or whatever, it just seemed natural to end the record on this sort of like, loss of consciousness sort of
and a kind of like a now what sort of idea too,
right? Like maybe I'm going to do another one, like maybe I'll cook up another record, or I wanted it to be too like the kind of thing where you get to the end and you're like, I wanted to leave this question mark in the air, kind of like, like you want to hear one more or something, I'm not sure if I succeeded so much, but I definitely had that like sort of that last minor key come in to suggest, maybe it's not over or something.
Well, maybe they had to go back to the trench, right? Unfortunately. Okay. Well, if you're still here, I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this conversation. Again, it's a subject near and dear to my heart. Clearly it is with Jay too. If you enjoyed our chat, if you enjoyed the tracks, or you're curious about it, I'd encourage you to check Jay's work out. It's available via his website, oldgreyhorror.com. Again, that's Grey with an E, not an A, oldgreyhorror.com. And via Bandcamp, oldgreyhorror.bandcamp.com. Either way, thanks for listening, and be well.